Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's Flawless Execution webinar. I'm Ansley Ankers, and I will be on the line to answer questions and provide technical support throughout the presentation. Before we continue, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to you by email. The presentation slides will be available following the webinar on Afterburner SlideShare. We will leave time at the end of today's webinar for live Q&A. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar using the chat or the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. Now I'll turn it over to Chris Gomez.
Great. Thank you so much, Ansley, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are out there. Please remember, just like Ansley said, please stick around until the end of the Q&A portion. Submit your questions there on the right side of the chat window there or in the Q&A block. I'd love to get to those questions at the end. We're going to answer whatever questions do pop up. And so, again, make sure you're writing those up. That'd be great. So today we're really going to talk about teams and, more importantly, how to build high-functioning and very effective teams. First off, let me introduce myself. As Ansley said, my name is Chris Gomez. I am a former United States Navy SEAL, and not only was I a SEAL, I did have the distinct honor of being chosen to be a SEAL instructor. So that meant by trade I was a corpsman, which is a medic, and that meant I went through 18 Delta, or Joint Special Operations Forces Trauma Course. During my time in the teams, I completed a couple of deployments, and I was able to qualify in many, well, I always say these SEAL-type things. I always shortcut this by saying basically I was paid to jump out of planes, shoot guns, blow things up, and scuba dive, which in my estimation was every teenage boy's dream come true. But after about 12 years, I like to think I grew up a little, and due to some new opportunities, I became a naval officer. And it was then that I had the chance to learn about contract management and even to become a business financial manager. In my final tour in the Navy, just prior to wrapping up 21 years of service where I retired, I was given the opportunity to attend the University of Texas, and I earned my MBA. It was really a life-changing event, and it's a primary reason that I'm here today talking with you representing Afterburner. So during my time at Afterburner, where I am an associate partner, I have had the pleasure of working with tons of different teams, mainly in software and CPG, beverage and snack companies, oil and gas, all over the map. And all of these teams had the expressed desire to help them get the absolute most out of their teams and their team building experience. So since you're here today on a webinar, you've likely engaged with Afterburner in the past in some capacity, and you know that we are a team of former elite and military professionals who have been teaching great business organizations the same tools and the techniques that we then learned in our military career. Now, I know I've given you a bit of my background, and you may be asking yourself, why am I sitting here on a Thursday afternoon listening to a former SEAL talk about teams? Well, as a former SEAL and instructor, I certainly think I'm uniquely positioned to understand both how teams effectively operate as well as how you can cure some of the typical team-type dysfunctions that you may encounter in your world. As SEALs, we care so much about the idea of teams, and the importance of that is that we don't refer to each other as SEALs. Sometimes we may refer to each other as frogmen or frogs, but 95% of the time when another SEAL is talking about another SEAL, we refer to each other as team guys. It is that ubiquitous. That means we are team guys first. That is our primary role and function. It's something that we are exceedingly proud about. So in this webinar, I'm going to share with you some of the stories from my experience as a SEAL, mainly training other Navy SEALs, and some of the stories that might be related to that with some of the teams that I've worked with out there in the private sector or in the corporate world. Really what we're going to do is I want to answer the question, or at least help you figure out how you can take the already effective team that you're operating with to that next level. We're going to talk some of the strategies and techniques that are going to give you the most value from your team experience. I'm going to share with you these strategies as both a leader and as a team member, and how you can effectively do both of these things. And lastly, we're going to look at enhancing our communication and collaboration among teams, because we find that collaboration is very common. It's very common throughout the private sector. However, effective collaboration isn't always, and that we're going to share with you some of these strategies and techniques that's going to help you enhance your communication and trust, most importantly, by aligning your team around a common picture of success, that long-term vision. So in a perfect world, we get to assemble our team, very carefully selecting each person based on certain skill sets, maybe a temperament, or even the cultural fit. Best case scenario, you are already out there teaching these skills and training your teams to be as effective from the get-go. But in reality, you're not likely starting a team from scratch. You're likely working with these teams that you're already working with these teams, or those are teams that you've essentially inherited, and you have to learn how to work with these folks on the fly. You know, what's funny is that even in the SEAL teams, we don't get to go out there and really pick and select each one of our platoon mates or our squadron mates. They are often selected for us for reasons way outside of our control, and we have to work hard to ensure that we are as effective as possible. We have to meld together as a team on the fly each and every time that we get pulled together. So no matter where you are in your team building process, you can begin to instill these lessons absolutely today. These are going to be some of the takeaways that are going to help your team get to that next level of success. This isn't just for the overall team or the overall team leader, you as the leader. It's really incumbent on each of us, each of our team members, to be as effective as possible and to utilize some of the techniques that we're going to talk about today. So today, by the time we wrap up and you're going to go back to your day, these are the things I really want you to walk away with, or at least be thinking about. I really hope that you're going to take away some of these tools, and that way you can start implementing these immediately. First off, how can you create a culture that is not afraid of failure? How can you foster within your teams that failure is okay? This isn't to say that you can continue to make the same mistakes. That's not it at all. But you have to be able to foster an environment where people don't hide their mistakes. The failure itself is not the issue. This is, of course, provided that you can all learn from that individual failure. I love the quote from Thomas Edison. He said that, I haven't failed. I have found 10,000 ways that don't work. How can you implement that level of thinking within your teams? So these failures and your team's understanding that they're okay, which is really the building block of trust. And that's what's one of the most key elements in understanding great teams. Trust is a key element and you gain trust by admitting your mistakes. After these inevitable mistakes pop up and they come to light, how can we leverage those learnings to not only raise the situational awareness of everyone in the room or on the team, but really raise that experience level for all of those who are out there working together. So let's first start. I'm going to level set on a few terms that I'm going to be using, and this is just the way that I think about these terms. And hopefully, at the end of the day, you're going to understand at least that point of view. The first point of order is to define team. Now, this is my definition as I feel, because I think that the word team is vastly overused in business. So the word team is defined as a number of persons associated together to work in an activity or a type of work. And on its face, that sounds great. However, it's been my experience that the term doesn't always simply mean just that. Management loves to say, my team, when they're describing a group of either subordinates or coworkers without giving much thought to what that actually entails. And so let me ask the question, who here knows what the optimal size of a working team is? And I can tell you it's not that vice president who thinks I'm working with a team of 243 people. So studies have shown that the optimal working group or the working team size is 7 plus or minus 2. Now, why is that important? So if you often start with too many people in the room, which is typically the case, people are constantly fighting for airtime. They're wanting to be heard, and typically they're just going to sit and advocate for their position or their point of view. If you have too few people in the room, you say less than 5, people begin to get very capacity constrained. Oftentimes, they're unable to contribute or add value to the task due to the subject perhaps even being outside of their comfort zone. So having the optimal team, again, depending on what you're doing, is vitally important. So one of the big dysfunctions that we see in my many interactions with teams, we call this artificial harmony. So what is artificial harmony? Artificial harmony is typically described as just making nice, although underneath there are some real issues or some real concerns. The ego, our own individual egos, want to maintain this false sense of peace so that we can keep our thoughts and feelings, and in doing so, we keep our thoughts and feelings to ourselves. People have a tendency to avoid conflict, regardless of that conflict perhaps even being very necessary to advance. We use the phrase, we prefer respectful truth to artificial harmony. That's something that we came up with at Afterburner, and I think it's absolutely true. I can imagine that many of you feel the same way. You have to be able to share very respectfully a level of truth to help mitigate that artificial harmony. And the last term of art I want to discuss with you is that of failure. So typically it has a very negative tone or a very negative connotation, and that is certainly not the way I think of it. I think of failure as being absolutely imperative, that we're creating a team that's not afraid of failure. It is just simply one step in the process of learning, and we continue to move forward with it. And so let's apply some of those terms as we use them, and this is kind of the way I think about it. So because of the amount of adversity that we face, this is going back to SEAL training, because of the amount of adversity that we face, we cannot be afraid of failure. In order to grow, you have to be able to put yourself out there. You have to understand that there will absolutely be mistakes. I don't expect perfection. In all my years as a SEAL, I never had a perfect mission. In BUDS or basic underwater demolition SEAL training, you will quickly learn that you will fail at something. Now, whether it's a timed evolution or the ocean catches you napping when you're paddling through the surf zone, or like these gents going into the rocks face first, you will fail. So as an instructor, I had numerous professional and NCAA college athletes who got washed out of training due to their inability to overcome these failures. They were expecting to be perfect. They had never faced that level of adversity in their lives. So when students are outside of their comfort zone, we wanted to know, we as instructors wanted to know how they responded. We're looking for them to adapt, react, and to overcome those individual failures. We expect failure in SEAL training, but it's what you do next that really matters. Do you give up and quit? Do you continue to make the same mistakes over and over again, or do you learn from those mistakes, pivot, and get better next time? And it's that failure and that expectation of failure that ultimately leads to humility. And I find that how you as a leader handles failure is an absolute key component in that. Your team has to know that they don't have all the answers. You yourself as a leader don't have all the answers. An element of humility must exist on your teams or in your environment that leads itself toward trusting one another. The only thing stopping us with understanding that humility is oftentimes our ego. And when our ego gets in the way, that's where a lot of the team building and the trust really stops. So that I always say that humility leads to trust. Your team must trust you as a leader. They have to feel psychologically safe to not only make the mistakes and iterate from them, but ultimately to admit those mistakes so that they're not hiding these things that could be catastrophic to the overarching team. Trust is the absolute key here. And so what I want to do is let's think about trust a little differently. Obviously, we know that as SEALs, we have to trust one another, but it certainly isn't just SEALs that have to think about it this way. I was listening to a TED Talk the other day, and it featured this British conductor. His name was Charles Hazelwood. He spoke of the idea of trust in a very different environment, but it was really very relatable to me, and I'm not even a musically inclined individual. But he was talking about the immense amount of trust needed to pull an entire 100-person plus orchestra together and hit one note out of absolute thin air. So he was talking about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And for those of you who may not know that music, it's that very famous one. It has that very famous note. It starts out, and it's out of thin air. There's no precursor to that note. There's no lead up. It's just a downbeat of the conductor's baton, and a split second later, music happens. 100 people working together and hitting that note into perfection. How do they get there? It certainly wasn't through artificial harmony. You can't pretend that everybody's doing a great job when that, in fact, is not the case. They had to iterate and move through tons of practice sessions in order to get there. And I'm sure Mr. Hazelwood had to call out individuals that weren't playing properly. They had to come over that type of thing. It was very interesting. So Charles said in this interview that he was doing, he said that trust is born out of mutual respect. And while I wholeheartedly agree, that trust often originates in shared experiences through adversity and failure. And so how do you generate that with the team? How do you come up with the idea that failure is okay, we can iterate, we all work in adverse situations, and so we have to be able to iterate and get better. So let me share with you then another story of a time where I was working with a corporate team, and we were assisting these folks in getting through this very important initiative. And while we were about halfway through execution, and the leader of this team, we always call them in our phraseology, we call the leader an ace, they decided that the objective that we planned about a month ago was all of a sudden unachievable. And rather than hitting their goal of 100 deployments, they changed that number altogether. They changed that number from 80 to 60. And then a couple of weeks later, obviously they weren't working very hard, or they weren't hitting their objectives, so they changed that number again. The ace knocked it down. Instead of hitting 80 or even 60, they said, you know what, we're going to try to hit 40. And so nothing had really transpired to cause this momentous shift. There were not any unforeseen pop-up threats that meant that their goal was unachievable. They were just not executing. And it's the way I interpret this is they weren't executing to their best of their ability. Team members were not showing up to what we call these execution gap meetings, or X gaps. People were late with deliverables. Other things took time away from them. Maybe the priorities had shifted. And this isn't to say that all team members weren't working hard or doing a good job. Many of them were trying and even doing their part and even dropping in their deliverables. However, we did have a few that were holding up the show. And so those few that were holding up the show, the ace, or the leader again, he never addressed these issues. People were allowed to continue their lackluster efforts, and when the mission was wrapped up, and what was so odd is that the mission wrapped up and the ace stood in front of his room and said that they were triumphant. They met their goal of 40 deployments. Obviously, it wasn't the original goal of 80, not at all. The goalpost had been shifted. And because of this, they essentially, the goalpost had been moved 50% closer. They said instead of having a 100-yard touchdown, now if you get to the 50, great. We're super excited, and now you're there. You know, team members that had tried to hit that original goal or that objective were left to really wonder, why was this mission even undertaken in the first place? Was this even that important? What's the reason for this? Because we certainly didn't meet the goal that we all planned together and we all said was important, and that was 80. This was the personification of artificial harmony. Rather than address those issues in real time, correct them so people could learn and move on, they allowed themselves, or he, the leader, allowed this team to be really unproductive and allowed this behavior to fester and cause the mission to ultimately, in my case, not be successful. And rather than call out individual team members very respectfully and let them know where they fell short of their goals, they were basically said, hey, mission accomplished. They hung the banner. The leader thought he was doing the team a service by not addressing the fact that they had failed. They had hit 40, great. That was halfway to their objective. Again, it's not to say that that failure was the worst thing that could have happened to the team. What was essentially reinforced through this artificial harmony is the belief that each individual team member cannot fail on their own. And so that's what the leader was communicating to his team. When you start moving those goalposts, you end up really demoralizing the team. So what do you think the effect on the overarching team was? Well, as you can imagine, trust within the team was completely destroyed at that point. You know, the ace didn't allow for the team to recognize the failure, address the issues that they were having, and address those root causes. Instead, people were essentially clinking champagne glasses at the end because their mission was 50% complete, or as the leader said, that they were successful. And so team members that were out there working and trying to hit that goal of 80 were certainly disillusioned, not only with their boss, but the rest of their teammates, and predictably, they were not able to make any significant progress on the follow-on missions. And in the years to come, many of those team members have either left the company or certainly moved on to other teams. You have to be able to reinforce personal responsibility. You have to train your team to accept responsibility for failure, to address it respectfully, of course, and then to correct it, learn from it, and get better. You know, we're not out here doing trust falls. We are about creating an environment where people can be their best selves and work together collectively to accomplish the goals of the team. This is what we said we were going to do. This is where we ended up. Moving the goalposts, in my mind, regardless of the progress, shows a lack of trust in the team, and essentially that falls on the leader's shoulders. So we've been talking a lot about failure, and let me tell you why. This is why it's so important. Your teams are already out there failing, whether you like it or not. We know that this is occurring in corporate America. This report was from the Market Associates, and it was published subsequently in HBR and through The Economist, and it showed that corporations are only achieving 33% of their strategic annual initiatives. That is an abysmal number. It seems terrible that 67% of the time we're not hitting our long-term objectives, our annual goals. And what that shows to me is a gap of execution. Again, it's a gap of teams not being able to work together, not being able to admit failure, learn, and move on. Instead, they're hunkered down, hiding even some of their mistakes. 33% of their results. Now, let's say that your teams are out there even executing. Let's say you're better than this and you're executing up to 50% of your objectives. There is still a lot of meat on the bone. There's still a lot of ways for your teams to improve their overall performance. So because you have a team that's afraid to admit that they failed, they're not going to benefit from anybody else's shared experiences. We always say that experience is a commodity that can very easily be shared amongst the team. You don't have to have a bunch of super experienced individuals, but when you have a team of individuals that have gained the experience and have learned lessons and have shared those lessons with other individuals, that is the way to ramp up the rest of the team's experience level. And we do that through those debriefs or through admitting our mistakes in front of one another. You know, each of us will go through this, oftentimes we'll go through this mental cost-benefit analysis when presented with an opportunity to share perhaps a lesson learned that we may have learned the hard way, or even some way that we can improve our own performance. And so we want to make sure that you as leaders are creating an environment where that cost-benefit analysis is very easily seen as a positive. Don't allow artificial harmony to take over by not sharing lessons learned from past failures. And that is really key. You want to make sure that your team, again, goes through that psychological safety where they understand that this particular failure or this particular issue isn't going to be met by the leadership as a huge issue, but really it's just a big learning opportunity. And because of these failures, because we're sharing with the collective team, we then can be a huge value add. Because we're having those individuals share some of the mistakes that they made and they can pivot and get better, this is what leads to that debrief. And this is something that we can certainly have another webinar. I know that we've done many debriefing type webinars, and that perhaps is a topic for another day. So thinking about what we just walked through, some of what we talked through, you cannot be afraid to fail. Don't fall victim to artificial harmony. Don't allow your teams to sit back and think that everything's going well because the open, honest, humble feedback isn't being accepted. You have to make sure that you're all moving toward a goal. Don't be artificially harmonious in that case. We find that failure leads to humility, and then that humility leads to the development of trust. When you can be humble with your teams, and we say this all the time in our training, is that the debrief and setting a tone is a very leader-led endeavor. So it's being humble to your team, admitting your mistakes in front of your team as a leader. Make sure that they have that environment where they can also admit their mistakes, because that's how you get better. And lastly, we have to make sure that we're utilizing some sort of debrief or some sort of ability to capture and share lessons learned from our others. We don't have to have names attributed to these individual lessons that we may have learned, but what we're looking for is that shared experience from individuals who have gone out, perhaps tried really hard, maybe failed at something, learned some great lessons so that the next time they're going to get that much better. And I certainly think that the great Nelson Mandela captured the idea, the absolute best about failure, when he said, "I never lose, I either win or learn." And that is the type of attitude that leaders should have when they're thinking about their individual teams too. Your teams don't lose, they either win or they learn. And that type of attitude is incumbent on the leadership. That is about being a good team player. That is about being someone on your team that's willing to make mistakes, admit what they don't know, ask for help, and learn from the process so they can share it out as much as possible. Boy, that was a lot of talking. That was a lot of talking. That's 26 minutes of me yammering on. So at this time, what we're going to do is we're going to move to the live Q&A portion of our presentation. Please remember, type your questions into the chat window or the Q&A box, which is located to the right of your screen. And as you enter and submit these questions, I want to invite each and every one of you to our learning group. This is our Afterburner Calling All Aces. It's a free user group that we have, and our goal is essentially to connect each and every one of you with each other. We want to provide the forum for all of you to share your lessons learned and even some of your best practices. I know that when you go out and you connect with other flawless execution practitioners, you're going to learn so much from different industries, and you're going to get a lot of different ideas to help you share with one another. So again, that website is www.callingallaces.com. So at this point, I'm sure I can see your questions coming in. So I'm going to kick it over to Ansley to see how we can get going.
Thank you, Gomez. And as a reminder, please submit your questions in the chat or the Q&A box on the right side of your screen, and we'll see them there. Our first question: after each mission, I assume you had a lessons learned so you can learn from those mistakes. What does this process look like?
I love those questions because you're absolutely right to assume that every single mission, whether it was a training exercise, whether it was a real deal full mission profile, whatever it is, you had to be able to come back and discuss those issues. And we would always conduct debriefs. I know that our fighter pilot brothers and sisters do the same exact thing as well. We come back, we conduct a debrief with one another, we admit what worked, what didn't, we have to share that out, and then the generation of that is we're coming up with a lot of different, perhaps some root causes for a particular success or a particular failure, and then those root causes are mined. We're looking for predominant or reoccurring root causes, and those things are mined then, and we'll build a lesson learned off of each one of those conglomerations of root causes.
Yes, how do you maintain harmony when transitioning between multiple teams?
That's again, this is a very leader-led endeavor. So maintaining harmony is vital. We talk about artificial harmony, which is the death to teams, in my opinion. You have to be able to be respectfully truthful with one another. And when you're moving within teams, you have to be able to share your expectation with your team members as well. This really comes down to individual work and individual attention to get that psychologically safe environment. So you as a leader, I'm assuming you as a leader, when you're talking about it in this way, when you're moving in between teams, you have to be able to set that tone for individuals, be that honest person that can throw out that feedback, can say, hey, listen, I made a mistake here. How can I learn from it? What do you have that I did wrong that I can help you improve as a team member?
Do you have suggestions for team members who are well-intentioned but keep making the same mistakes over and over again, demonstrating spotty attention to detail on important details?
So that's a really tough one, because that doesn't really, when we talk about debriefs, we talk about issues where we're not trying, we're going to learn from our mistakes. We are going to figure out how to improve as a team. But when you're addressing the same type of things where somebody's being lack of attention to detail, these other issues where they're messing up, that doesn't necessarily come back to a debrief. I mean, obviously, documentation's key. I can't tell you how easy or hard that may be to move people onto different teams in your environment and in your organization, but it certainly is. It's a tough one. It's a tough question because we don't like to have people in our environment, especially in the SEAL teams, who are continuously making the same mistakes over and over again. In my old world, those people would be removed from the team. And so it's up to the leader at this point to either see if they can work with them and see if they can continue making small-scale improvements. But that's really the way I would address that. I guess what I'm trying to say is, through a debrief, you might uncover 20 things that you or your team may have did wrong, that may have did incorrectly. You can't correct all 20 things by the time you're on the next mission, but you can correct 2 or 3 things. So what I ask you as a leader is to say, these are the 3 things I want you to really concentrate on for next time. And these are the only 3 things I want you to improve upon. And that's what you're going to be held accountable to next time. And if they continue to have those same mistakes pop up over and over again, then I think it's probably time for a different type of conversation.
In working with dispersed teams for short-term projects, how do I get members to complete the tasks on time when their primary duties often have a higher priority?
This is a really interesting question because we run into this a lot. Whenever we go out and do high-definition destination builds where we're building that long-term strategy for success with a lot of different organizations and teams, prioritization is the #1 issue that comes up, and it is hard to come up with to be able to reprioritize individuals. If this isn't one of their key initiatives that they're being measured against, it is hard for them to be on the right team. So one, I would suggest looking at the teams, making sure that you have the right people in the room, the right people that are able to add value and come up with that list of courses of action that will help accomplish that goal. 2, I'd make sure that we are holding each other accountable. So it's really 2 separate questions. One is, how do I get people to finish their things on time? And 2 is, how do I get people to reprioritize? So the way that you get people to finish their things on time is to hold one another accountable. It goes back to that example I used from that one team in the corporate world where nobody was being held accountable for getting their tasks done on time. And that would often have a long-term catastrophic effect on the team because if Sally didn't get her stuff done, Mary cannot finish her project because it's waiting on Sally's deliverable. And so making sure that we're holding teams accountable to that. We have these execution gap meetings that we conduct at a very periodic basis, which is maybe it's every week, every month, whatever that is, and we specifically address that individual courses of action or that individual mission objective, and we hold one another accountable to those tasks by saying, David, is your task complete? Yes, great. Joel, is your task complete? No. Okay, why is it not complete? How can we assign some resources today to ensure that we get that task complete now? Because we know ultimately it's holding up the show for the rest of the team.
Does the team of 7 plus or minus 2 change based on the size of the company? What are the influences of this size or scope? Does limiting or growing the team size create barrier by exclusion or inclusion?
Yeah, so again, that's a couple of part question. It doesn't necessarily affect, the size of the organization might not necessarily dictate that. It really just depends on what that type of project that you're trying to uncover is. So the way we break down our missions, if you will, we start off with the long term, the 3-year, maybe it's a 3-year high definition destination. We break those down into perhaps 3 or 4 critical leverage points, and we'll call those perhaps even strategic campaigns. And those campaigns might be 6 to 18 months in duration. And that campaign then fractalizes, or at least it imitates the same process of planning, briefing, executing, and debriefing down to lower levels. And so what I'd ask is that you break those tasks up into bite-sized objectives and build a team around those particular tasks. if you can do that. And so you, again, maybe it's about breaking down silos within your organization. So you have to involve your finance people and your marketing people and your sales people. So you have to make sure that you have the right folks on the team. But as I said, sometimes that might grow. It's just something to remember. This isn't a hard and fast rule. It is just a best practice that we've seen. So again, having a team of perhaps 12 people, realize that you're operating a little bit at risk because you have 12 folks instead of maybe 9, or maybe you have 15 individuals. Just recognize that there's going to be some people that are going to be fighting for airtime and trying to push their agenda along rather than being overall contributors to the positive of that team.
How do you balance pointing out personal failure within the team without creating resentment?
This is where we always talk about, so building that personal accountability. You want people to be upset that they disappointed the team and really to work hard to not doing so. But if you uncover failure, like I said, if we talk through this, we talk through failure as being okay. So it's okay that somebody failed because they went out on a limb and they tried something that might have been a little bit different, and the result was, they produced the wrong product or something happened there. You as a leader have to be able to instill that environment where it's okay to fail, and it's okay. And so it's not, we're not holding individuals accountable saying, Bill, you absolutely failed on this. Let's talk about how you failed. The way that we talk about this in our debriefing training that we do, it's all about the leader having to set that tone. And that means the leader stands up in front of the team and admits their fault. So I'll stand up in front of my team and I'll say, hey, team, I did this wrong, I did this wrong, I did this wrong. What did you see that I did wrong, and how can I get better? And when you establish that tone as the leader, then it shouldn't be, then the teammates should feel absolutely safe to be able to share the things that they perhaps did wrong. So it's not about a personal attack. I'm not trying to blame people individually, but what I'm trying to do is get better as a team. And so they have to be able to accept that inside-outside criticism of their teammates. And again, you have to do it in a very respectful way.
Do you plan for mistakes in a mission? And when they occur, how do you manage your feelings and impulses to react?
So we certainly do not plan to have mistakes in our execution or in our missions. That's never the goal. But what we do talk about, and we talk about it frequently, is we talk about building contingencies. These are those what ifs. And we always say this in our training. I love it. It's, that famous philosopher, Mike Tyson, said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And this is that punch in the face. What are the contingencies? What are the what ifs that will lead to better execution? So you as a team need to identify those contingencies and really, more importantly, identify those triggers or those leading indicators that a contingency is going to take place. That's the way we help mitigate those pop-up threats or some of those failures that may transpire while we're executing.
When managing virtual teams, what is the best approach for ensuring the individuals are achieving their tasks, proactively identifying challenges, holding them accountable to deliver in accordance with the project timeline?
So we always talk about getting an execution rhythm, and you have to have a process that you can reach out to your teammates to ensure that they're completing these tasks on time. I'm assuming this is more than just a weekly task. And so if we have this, again, I'm referring to our methodology, we have a mission objective, which is a goal that we're trying to achieve over maybe a 6 or an 8 week period of time. And so we break those things down into those objectives. We have very regularly scheduled meetings. So on every Tuesday in conference room B at 10:30 in the morning, we are going to talk about this objective. And the way that you hold distance teams accountable is to make sure they show up on time. You start your meeting at 10:30. You as the ace go around and you collect information prior to that so that you are at least understanding as to what's happening in the mission environment. You share that information with the team so that you're raising everybody else's situational awareness. But in doing so, you're also holding one another accountable to what they said they were going to achieve during that planning session. So the way that we suggest it is, again, having very periodic, very short duration, very focused meetings on individual objectives for that team. Talk about them, and again, raising situational awareness. That's the best way we've seen to combat some of those issues.
How would one follow up on or lead the action items in a meeting when you're younger than the other team members?
You know, age in my mind doesn't necessarily come into play here. In the SEAL teams, we had a very open mindset and a very open culture where we had to share feedback with one another. And oftentimes the officers that we have in our platoons or in our squadrons are younger than the most experienced people on the entire team. You know, we might have a chief in there that's, 36 years old and he's completed 5 deployments, and the person that's overall in charge of the actual operation or that entire platoon is a 26-year-old lieutenant who is on his 2nd platoon. So that doesn't necessarily, you have this positional authority, and you have to be able to hold one another. You have to be able to put that ego aside and be able to accept feedback from individual team members regardless of the age. And if you happen to be the younger person looking to hold other people accountable, it's all about getting these objectives, getting these things written down so that you're not debating these feelings, or you're not debating these emotions, but essentially you're debating facts. This is what you said you were going to deliver by, April 23rd. This is where we're at. How can we close that gap? That's kind of the way I would discuss it. And again, if there's any question that I've answered that you don't find is adequate enough, or maybe the way that this is kind of structured, and you have more follow-on questions, reach out to me on LinkedIn, shoot me a note. I'll be happy to answer those however we can.
If a team member is struggling to connect, is it better to spend the time trying to get them integrated or to remove them from the team?
So as I stated, when we talk about how our teams are kind of focused and how our teams are built in a platoon space or in the SEAL environment, oftentimes, unless there's an individual who is committing safety violations or has committed some other issues, we are stuck with the people that we got assigned. And so those are going to be 16 of your closest friends for the next 2 years. And you don't necessarily have to like everybody. You don't have to necessarily connect with everybody individually, but it's up to the leader. It's incumbent on the leader to ensure that everybody is at least getting their job taken care of. And if you're having individuals on the teams that are failing to deliver objectives, that's a different conversation. But if it's somebody that's just a little bit out there, it doesn't necessarily relate to team building, but I'd say that you have to make sure that you as a leader are communicating in various ways, meaning you're appealing to both introverts and extroverts. You're having to provide information to them on an individualized basis perhaps, or maybe they prefer phone calls, or maybe they prefer the face-to-face interactions. You have to consider that of each team member, because everybody's going to respond differently to being on a team.
What is one of the best ways to introduce this in a new team culture and build confidence within the team members?
So I'd say one of the best ways to introduce this concept and this thinking is one, if you're not conducting debriefs already, start, because you're leaving a lot of great objectives on the team. And our website has tons of information about conducting debriefs and how you can go about doing that. I know that we have other webinars that have been dedicated to discussing debriefs, but debrief with your team. You have to, as a leader, set that tone, set that expectation, understand what, kind of what the best practices have been on the team, plan together. You have to conduct open planning. You have to bring people in. You want to make sure that your team members have their fingerprints on the plans that you're trying to execute against. And the way that we do that, we conduct open planning, in that we bring in individuals, we ask for their input, we ask for information from them, because that's the way that you're going to get buy-in, and that's the way you're going to enhance that team experience.
How do you handle the individual that continuously talks over everyone else on calls, especially when they're attempting to appear to have more authority than they do?
Yeah, these are good ones. Again, this kind of goes back to that introvert-extrovert conversation, perhaps. You know, when we talk about objectives and we talk about our execution gap meetings, it is led by one individual. And this isn't an open forum discussion. This is very pointed questions get asked to individuals. So I'm not certain in the environment that you're dealing with into where you're encountering some of those challenges. But if it's around one objective or something that you're trying to achieve within the team, we find that having a facilitator oftentimes helps to keep people quiet, because again, it's not about that individual. It's about, hey, we're trying to get this done for the team. I would remind them, hey, we're trying to conduct this, again, having a structured process. We're trying to conduct this execution gap meeting perhaps in 15 minutes. And when we keep getting interrupted, then we're having to stop, and it's going to elongate that, and that affects the rest of the day. Oftentimes people think they're adding value when they're not. And maybe one of the answers is perhaps even looking at team size or the type of discussions you're having. That's a really interesting question, though, and I would love to take that one offline, too. I have some other techniques I'd love to share, but I don't think it's appropriate for this forum.
Yes, and we are at the end of our time today. I'd like to remind everyone as we close out that this webinar is being recorded and it will be sent out to you by email. Gomez, I'll let you close us out.
Hey, those were some awesome questions. Again, you see my LinkedIn there. Find me on LinkedIn if you have some questions. It's Chris Gomez, MBA, I think. I guess there's a couple of Chris Gomez's in the world. Who knew? Find Christopher Gomez, MBA on LinkedIn. I'd love to answer those questions for you. I really appreciate your time and attention. This is obviously being recorded, as Ansley said. Thank you so much for being a member of this webinar, and look forward to connecting with you in the past and perhaps even answering some of your questions or learning from some of your team building experiences. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.